Vivid verses.
I have a theory about silence. Not the uncomfortable kind that pulls between strangers on elevators, but the particular silence that settles over a life that has found its own rhythm. The kind that sits in the corners of a well-ordered apartment on a Sunday morning, when the coffee is exactly right and the light comes through the kitchen window at an angle that makes even ordinary things look considered. That silence, I've come to believe, is the closest thing to contentment that a person can manufacture for themselves. My name is Cole Whitfield, and for most of my 34 years, I have been building toward that silence with the same patient deliberateness that I bring to everything else. I grew up in Harton, a mid-sized city in the Northeast that had the ambition of a larger place, but the budget of a smaller one. My father was a structural engineer who taught me, mostly by example, that the integrity of a thing depends entirely on its foundation. My mother was a high school literature teacher who believed that every story worth telling had, at minimum, one character who chose clarity over comfort. They were not wealthy. They were not particularly socially prominent, but they were consistent, and in consistency, I learned to find a kind of elegance. I studied applied mathematics at Dunfield University, then spent 2 years at a consulting firm called Parrish and Orrin before deciding that the most interesting problems were the ones companies hadn't yet figured out they had. I started a small analytics practice called Whitfield Advisory, operating out a rented office on Callaway Street, 3 blocks from the harbor. Within 4 years, it had grown into something I was quietly proud of: a team of 9, a client list that included a regional bank, 2 logistics companies, and a mid-sized pharmaceutical distributor. Nothing flashy. Everything sound. My apartment was on the 6th floor of a converted textile building called the Larkspur in the Fenwick district. High ceilings, original brick, windows that faced west, so the evenings were always theatrical with light. I kept it tidy not out of compulsion, but out of preference. A place that reflects discipline on the outside tends to support it on the inside. I ran 3 mornings a week along the harbor path. I cooked on weekends, real cooking, with mise en place and a glass of something worth drinking while the onions went translucent. I read widely, slept reliably, kept a small circle of friends I trusted completely. My closest friend was a man named Troy Adkins, who ran a maritime insurance brokerage and had been my college roommate. Troy was the kind of person who told you the truth before you asked for it, which is a rare and valuable quality. The silence I mentioned, the Sunday morning kind, I had built it deliberately, and for a long time I lived inside it comfortably. Then I met Renata. She came into my life at a dinner party hosted by my colleague Bev Harmon, whose husband ran an architecture firm. 12 people, a long table, good wine. Renata was seated across from me and 2 seats down, which was the perfect distance to be interesting without being immediate. She had dark hair, she wore loosely pinned, and she laughed at something the man beside her said in a way that suggested she decided to find it funny rather than actually finding it so. I noticed that, filed it away without attaching any particular meaning to it. We were introduced properly after dinner, near the windows. She worked in brand strategy for a mid-sized firm called Verano Partners. She was intelligent and well-spoken, and she had a quality I've always found difficult to resist, which is the quality of seeming to pay complete attention when you spoke. Not performed attention, or so I believed then. The kind that makes a person feel that what they're saying has weight. We had dinner the following week, just the 2 of us, at a place called Corbon's on Telford Avenue. It went well. The conversation moved easily between subjects. She had opinions she could defend. She didn't reach for her phone once in 3 hours. I should say something plainly. I am not a man who falls fast. I observe. I gather data, not in a clinical or cold way, but in the way that any person who has been burned by carelessness eventually learns to do. So the early weeks with Renata were pleasant, but measured on my side. She was bright, She was engaging, and I enjoyed her company. I was willing to see where the ground led. The first months were genuinely good. We settled into a rhythm that felt natural. Dinners on Friday nights, often at Corbon's, sometimes at her choice, a Thai place she liked called Saradi on Pembroke Street, small and loud and excellent. We'd go to the occasional weekend market along the harbor. She'd come to the Larkspur on Sunday afternoons, and we'd cook together, or rather I'd cook, and she'd sit on the counter talking while I did. It was easy. It felt like something that had been assembled correctly. I introduced her to Troy in the third month. Afterward, walking back to my car, Troy said two things. First, she's magnetic. I can see it. And then, after a beat, she watches you more than she listens to you. Not sure what she's looking for. I acknowledged both observations and kept them in a folder I didn't open immediately. Renata had a younger sister named Petra. I met Petra for the first time at a small birthday dinner for Renata. 6 people at a restaurant called Fallow, intimate and candlelit. Petra was 2 years younger, also attractive, also confident, but differently configured. Where Renata's charm operated at a conversational level, Petra's operated at a spatial one. She arranged herself in rooms. She knew exactly where the light fell. She shook my hand when we met and held it a fraction of a second longer than necessary. And I noticed this the way I notice most things, without reacting to it, simply noting it as a data point. Over dinner, Petra was engaging in a way that occupied more territory than the occasion warranted. She directed a disproportionate amount of conversation toward me, asked about my work with a specificity that implied she'd been briefed, leaned in when I spoke. Once, when I turned to say something to Renata, I caught Petra watching me with an expression that resolved itself into a smile just quickly enough that it might have been nothing. I drove home that night thinking about the geometry of the table, about the way Renata had watched her sister more than she'd watched me, about the specific texture of that watching, not possessiveness or warmth, but something more like study. I opened the folder Troy had handed me and added a few notes. The problems with Renata began in the 5th month, which I note was also approximately when I became aware that Petra had begun appearing in our shared spaces with unusual frequency. The nature of the problems, small at first, almost imperceptible. A version of an event would be offered to me that didn't quite match the event as I had experienced it. Early on, the gaps were narrow enough that I considered my own memory. I'm not arrogant about my faculties. I believe in checking my own instrument before blaming the music. The first clear instance, we had made plans to meet at a gallery opening, a small event for a photographer friend of Bev's, on a Thursday evening. I arrived at 7, as we had agreed. Renata arrived at 7:40 and was, when she reached me, already presenting a version of events in which we had set 8 o'clock. I was certain we had not. I confirmed the time the morning of via text. I didn't argue. I said something neutral and let the evening continue. But when I got home, I checked my phone. 7 o'clock. Her text read, "See you at 7, wearing the green jacket. Don't lose me in the crowd." A small thing. I didn't raise it, but I kept it. The second instance, 2 weeks later. She told a story at dinner with another couple, friends of hers named Laura and Cam, about an argument she and I had supposedly had over restaurant choices, which had concluded with me sulking for the rest of the evening. The story was told lightly, presented as affectionate ribbing. The problem was that the argument it described had not occurred. There had been a mild discussion about whether to try somewhere new or go to Saradi, which had lasted approximately 90 seconds and ended with me saying Saradi is fine with me, and that being the end of it. No sulking, no unresolved tension. I watched her tell the story. Laura and Cam laughed. Renata glanced at me once while telling it, quickly, and what I saw in that glance was not mischief or forgetfulness. It was a kind of measurement. She was checking whether I'd push back. I smiled and said nothing, but I was now conducting a proper analysis. Over the following 6 weeks, I cataloged 9 distinct incidents. Not all major, but all following the same pattern. A reality I had experienced clearly being replaced in conversation with a revised version. Usually one that positioned me as slightly less competent, slightly more erratic, or slightly more dependent on her steadiness than I actually was. There was the time she told her friend group at a small house party in the Kelway neighborhood that I'd forgotten our 1-month anniversary and she'd had to remind me. We had never marked our 1-month anniversary. It had not been discussed. She introduced this fabricated neglect of mine casually, in the way you mention something everyone already knows. There was the time she suggested, during a conversation about a client decision I'd made, that I had originally wanted to take the opposite position and she had talked me around to the right one. The decision had been mine, arrived at independently before I'd mentioned it to her. Her contribution had been to say that sounds smart. There was the evening she told me, with a gentle, practiced expression, that I'd said something at Bev's dinner that had been a little dismissive toward the women at the table, and that she'd been embarrassed. I reviewed the evening with the same thoroughness I'd apply to any analytical problem. There was nothing. I had been, by any reasonable measure, attentive and considerate throughout. 3 of the women at that dinner were professional colleagues I respect deeply. When I said, calmly, that I didn't believe I'd been dismissive, she said, "You probably don't remember it the way it came across." Then she touched my arm and said, "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I just want you to be aware." Her voice was warm. Her eyes were watchful. "I probably don't remember it the way it came across." I turned this sentence over for days. It is a beautiful trap if you understand the mechanism. It concedes nothing. It doesn't accuse. It simply relocates the problem inside the accused's own perception, and it does so with the cover of concern. The only counter is to trust your own record, which the phrasing preemptively undermines by framing your record as the problem. I trusted my record. I had always trusted it, and I had kept it carefully. But I also knew that continuing to voice disagreement would accelerate what was becoming a predictable cycle. She'd revise. I'd question. She'd express patient disappointment at my inability to accept her perspective. I'd walk away having neither conceded nor resolved anything. I began thinking seriously about ending the relationship in the 7th month. What made me wait was not doubt about my analysis. It was the same discipline that had served me in every other area of my life. The commitment to not acting until I understood the situation fully. I want to know not just what was happening, but why. I am not interested in winning arguments. I am interested in understanding systems. The picture clarified itself over the following 3 weeks in a way I had not anticipated. Petra called me. She called my personal number, which I had never given her. She said Renata had given it to her for an emergency and that she was in the Fenwick district and her car had broken down and she didn't want to worry Renata. Could I come? I was 2 blocks from the Larkspur when I took the call, and against a judgment I should have acted on more quickly, I drove to where she said she was. There was no broken down car. Petra was sitting at a wine bar called Linton on Crest Street, looking entirely untroubled, a glass of something white in front of her and a second glass on the table. She said, "I thought you might need a drink." I stayed for 17 minutes, long enough to understand what was actually happening. Petra was polished and direct, and she did not entirely hide her intentions. She said things like, "Renata doesn't appreciate what she has, and you deserve someone who actually sees you." She said my name in a particular way, twice. She mentioned twice that she and Renata had always wanted the same things before adding, with a careful smile, "until recently." I was polite. I was not interested. I said I had to be somewhere, which was true. I had a call with a client at 8 that I'd been on my way home to prepare for, and I left before the second glass of wine could be presented as a committed choice. Driving home, the full architecture of the previous 7 months arranged itself with a clarity that was almost elegant. The consistent downward revision of my competence and reliability. The manufacturing of a version of me that was slightly unsteady, slightly forgetful, slightly in need of management. Not aggressive gaslighting. Nothing theatrical or cruel. Something more surgical. The steady erosion of my confidence in my own account of events, run in parallel with what I now recognized as a campaign to position Renata as the stable one, the thoughtful one, the one keeping things together. And now Petra, offering herself as an upgrade, an escape. The implied message: you're with someone who doesn't value you, but I do. I considered the possibility that Petra had acted independently, that this was a solo maneuver Renata knew nothing about. I gave it appropriate weight and then set it aside. The specificity with which Petra had asked about my work at that first dinner, the same work she'd asked about tonight, and the way she'd said Renata doesn't appreciate what she has with the confidence of someone whose position is built on prior intelligence, told me the two were not operating separately. I had been managed, methodically, by both of them. The interesting thing, and I say interesting because it is the most accurate word, is that I did not feel rage. I felt something more like the specific satisfaction of a problem finally yielding its actual shape. The way you feel when a complex equation resolves. Not pleasure exactly. Recognition. I sat at my desk and prepared for my 8 o'clock call. When it was over, I poured 2 fingers of a decent bourbon called Haraway Reserve that I kept on the shelf above the sink, and I sat with it by the western window and watched the city run its lights. I would end it cleanly. I owed Renata a direct conversation, not because she'd earned it, but because I owed it to myself to close things properly. And I would say what I had to say once, clearly, without drama, and without the kind of escalation she might have been banking on. I sent her a message the next morning asking to meet that evening. She suggested Corbon's. I said I'd rather somewhere quieter, somewhere we could talk without an audience. She suggested her apartment. That was fine with me. Renata's apartment was in the Calder building on Hove Street, a nice building, modern, managed well. She decorated it thoughtfully. She had good taste in objects, if not in people, or at least not in how she treated them. I arrived at 7:30. She'd made tea, which struck me as preemptive. Tea is a de-escalation prop, a signal that this is going to be a comfortable conversation. She put 2 mugs on the coffee table and sat across from me in the low armchair she favored, legs folded beneath her. Composed. She had prepared herself for something. She knows this is a closing conversation, I noted, or suspects it. She has positioned herself as calm and generous in advance. I sat on the sofa and didn't touch the tea. I want to be straightforward with you, I said. I think we should end this. She looked at me for a moment. The composure held, but just underneath it something shifted, a micro-recalculation. She had prepared for this possibility, but perhaps not for the directness. Can you tell me why? She said. Her voice was measured, concerned, appropriately soft. I can. I had thought about how much to say. I had decided on honesty without inventory. The principle, not the catalog. I've noticed a consistent pattern over the last few months in which my experience of events gets revised in conversation. Not once, not twice. Repeatedly. Events I remember clearly get replaced with versions that position me as less reliable than I am. I've checked my own record against it carefully. The pattern holds. She tilted her head. Cole, said with patience, I don't think that's what's happening. I think sometimes, I'm not asking you to confirm it, I said. I'm not here to win an argument. I'm telling you what I've observed, and I'm telling you it's the reason I think we should stop. You're characterizing something that's been. Renata. I kept my voice even. Not cold, not hard. Even. I've thought about this carefully, and I'm not going to be moved off it. I'm not angry. I don't want to go through everything item by item. I think the relationship has a fundamental problem, and I think we should end it. She was quiet for a moment. I watched the working of her face, the genuine calculation happening behind her eyes. She was deciding which version of herself to present next. I think you've been pulling away for a while, she said finally, shifting to something warmer, more intimate. I think something changed, and I don't fully understand it. And I think if you're feeling like I've been unsupportive, then that's something I want to understand. Elegant, I thought. She's absorbed the accusation and reframed it as her own failing, which positions her as the one willing to do the work, and implicitly asks me whether I'm willing to do the same. I appreciate that, I said, but I've made my decision. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she sat back and the warmth dialed down, not dramatically, just enough that I could see it for the mechanism it was. She reached for her tea. She was preparing for a new approach. She never got to deploy it. The front door opened. I did not immediately recognize that this was part of anything deliberate. It occurred to me first as simple coincidence, someone with a key arriving unexpectedly. But Petra walked in with the specific energy of someone who had been standing outside the door for some time, waiting for a signal, and had decided she'd waited long enough. She was dressed carefully, not formally, but with the kind of deliberate casualness that takes effort. Jeans and a dark jacket, hair down. She had brought nothing with her. No grocery bag, no reason, which confirmed she had not come for any other purpose. She looked at me first. Cold, warm, direct. Then at her sister. Renata's composure cracked at the edges. What are you doing here? I thought you might need. I didn't ask you to come. I sat very still and watched the two of them with the same attention I'd give to anything that is resolving itself. The geometry of the room had changed completely. Petra had taken a position near the door that was not quite entering, not quite retreating, a held position, strategic. Renata had unfolded her legs and sat forward. The warm, composed version of her gone entirely now, replaced with something genuinely unguarded and sharp. You were taking too long, Petra said, and the words were directed at Renata, but the implications were aimed at me. She wanted me to understand what taking too long meant. She wanted me to see the timeline. I understood the timeline. Too long to do what? Renata said. Her voice was low and precise. He wasn't going to... This was working, Petra. It wasn't working. You've been doing this for 6 months, and he's still... She glanced at me, recalibrated, and stopped herself. The sentence she hadn't finished. He's still with her. Or something like it. He's still committed. He hasn't destabilized enough. He hasn't arrived at the door I've been holding open. Renata stood up. I told you I had it handled. You told me a lot of things. This was mine too. You have been coaching her. The sentence arrived in my head fully formed before I said it. Not a question. I said it in the same, even tone I'd used throughout, which seemed to land with more force than a raised voice would have. Both of them turned to me. On how to do this. On the specific approach. On how to revise things. How to make me question my own memory. You designed it, and she executed it. The silence that followed had a different quality from the Sunday morning kind. This one had edges. Petra didn't deny it. She looked at me with an expression I could only describe as frustrated transparency. She'd been caught. She knew it, and some part of her had wanted to be caught, because being caught was its own form of revelation. The revelation being, I've been watching you long enough to know how to take something from your life. Renata's eyes had gone to Petra with a fury I recognized as genuine. You couldn't stay out of it for one night. You were losing him. I wasn't losing anything. I just needed more time to do what? Petra's voice rose. To keep him confused long enough that he'd. That's not what I was. You've been reporting back to me every week like I'm your supervisor, and now you want to act like this was all your... I stood up, not dramatically. I simply rose from the sofa, unhurriedly, and both of them stopped talking. I looked at them both in turn, not with anger. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I have never found anger useful in the way that decisive clarity is useful. Anger is a pressure that needs releasing. Clarity is a position. I was in a position. I'm not a prize to be competed for, I said. Neither of you respects me as a person. The room held those words for a moment. I watched both of them absorb the specific weight of being addressed as a unit, as co-architects of something rather than as opponents in a dispute about it. I picked up my jacket from where I'd draped it over the arm of the sofa. Cole, Renata started. I moved toward the door. Petra stepped slightly to one side, not quite out of the way, and I walked past her with the same measured pace I'd carried throughout the entire evening. The front door closed behind me with its own weight. I didn't force it. The walk to my car took 4 minutes. The drive home was 22. I listened to nothing, which was a choice. Upstairs at the Larkspur, I poured the other 2 fingers of Haraway Reserve and stood at the western window again. The city was doing its regular business below. A tram moved along its line. Someone in the building across the way was eating dinner alone and watching something on a screen I couldn't see. I ran the evening through my mind the way I run any completed analysis. Not with pleasure, not with distress. With the kind of honest accounting that helps me understand where I had been clear and where I had been slower than I should have been. I had been slower than I should have been. Not by much. But I had given the situation 6 weeks beyond when the pattern was already established, because I'd wanted to understand it fully before acting. That was discipline, and discipline had served me. But I could have moved it 5 weeks and not missed anything essential. I would note that for the future. The central error, if you could call it that, was not in my analysis, but in my charitable accounting of Renata at the start. I had observed at Bev's dinner that her laugh was a decision. I had noted after the first month that she watched me with a quality of measurement rather than simply attention. I had filed these observations in a folder rather than weighting them properly at the time. Lesson: when your first data is clean, trust it. What Petra and Renata had built was, in its own way, architecturally coherent. Renata would spend months softening my trust in my own account of events. Not dramatically, not in ways that would trigger open confrontation, but gradually enough that I would begin to feel slightly unsteady in myself, slightly less confident, slightly more reliant on her version of things. Once I was in that condition, Petra would appear as a contrasting figure, someone who saw me, who understood me, whose availability felt like rescue. It was a 2-stage approach. The first stage loosened the foundation. The second offered a new one. It had failed because my foundation was not ultimately loosened. I kept my own records. I trusted them. When I felt the pressure of a revised reality, I didn't concede to it. I studied it. And when the study was complete, I moved. I thought about Troy, who had said she watches you more than she listens to you in the 3rd month. I would tell him what had happened. He would say something like, "I'm sorry," and also, "I told you." That would be accurate, and I would accept both parts. I thought briefly about what Petra had wanted. A man she had studied through the lens of her sister's intelligence reports. A man whose qualities she'd assessed at a distance for 6 months, while her sister field-tested his responses. There was something almost respectful in the effort, if respect could be entirely divorced from integrity, which it cannot. I thought about Renata and whether I felt anything about her beyond the clean resolution of a problem. I was honest with myself. I had liked her. Not deeply, not in the way that leaves permanent geography, but genuinely. The early months had been good in a way that was real, or at least real enough. The dinners, the Sunday cooking, the ease of conversation when it wasn't being used to revise history. That goodness, I now understood, was probably the most deliberate part of the whole construction. You cannot erode something that was never built. She had built something real first, carefully, so that the erosion would have material to work on. That was cold in a way that I sat with for a moment, honestly, before setting it down. She had made one fundamental miscalculation, which was the same one most people make about men like me. The assumption is that discipline reads as rigidity, that controlled responses indicate I see clearly, I assess accurately, and I act when the picture is complete. I simply do not perform any of those things while they're happening. I called Troy the next morning. He answered on the second ring the way he always does, Whitfield, as if he's been expecting the call for a few hours and is mildly amused that it took this long. I told him what had happened. All of it. The pattern over 7 months, Petra's wine bar maneuver, the evening at Renata's apartment, the way it had all resolved with the two of them fighting in the room I'd already left. There was a pause when I finished. Both of them, he said. That's actually sophisticated. It is, I said. I'll give it that. And Petra just walked in at the critical moment. She'd been outside, waiting, got impatient. What did they do when you left? They were arguing when I walked out. Probably still are. Another pause. You said your line and walked out while they were still fighting. Yes. He stopped. I could hear him working through it. That's almost too clean. How do you do that? You just have to know what a closed door sounds like, I said, and make sure you're the one closing it. Troy offered to meet for drinks that evening. I said yes. We went to a bar called Foundry on Oldham Street. Small, wood-paneled, the kind of place that stays the right temperature even in winter. We drank something amber and talked about his work for a while, and then about mine, and then about something he'd read that had made him think, and the conversation found its own level, the way good conversation does. Walking home afterward, I took the long way along the harbor path. It was a Wednesday evening, and the path was quiet. A few joggers, a couple walking a dog that wanted to stop and examine everything. The water was dark and made its small harbor sounds. I had built something for myself over many years that operated the way I wanted it to operate. Good work, good friends, a home I was glad to return to. I had let someone into that construction who had treated it as a system to be subverted rather than something worth joining. The damage on honest inspection was superficial. A few months, some reclaimed clarity. The foundation was sound. I thought about what my father would have said in his characteristic minimal way. He wouldn't have commented on Renata or Petra. He would have looked at the structure, run his hand along the wall, pressed at the joint, and said something like, "Looks like it held." Then he'd have made coffee. My mother, differently, would have said, "The story told you what it was from the first chapter. You just gave it until the end to be sure." I thought she was right. I also thought that knowing the story early and understanding it fully were not the same thing, and that I had needed both before I acted. I was comfortable with that. At the Larkspur, I made coffee even though it was late enough that I shouldn't have, and I stood at the window with it, and the city was doing the particular thing it does at that hour, settling, contracting, running its quiet late systems. Somewhere a bus stopped and released a few passengers into the night. A light in a far building went off. The silence came back. Not all at once. It never does. It filters back and gradually, like good light through old glass. It found the corners of the apartment the way it always had, occupying them without urgency, without competition. I finished the coffee, washed the cup, went to bed at a reasonable hour. The foundation was exactly where I'd left it.
Thanks for listening.